So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Bussard. I'm the founder of Wave Therapeutics and a member of StartOut's VC and Fundraising Programming Board. Thank you for joining us for tonight's early stage fundraising AMA event. I'm told we have a record turnout tonight, and I'm excited to be your host for the event. So StartOut is a US-based nonprofit founded in 2009 that focuses on supporting LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs and startup founders. Our mission is to increase the number, diversity, and impact of LGBTQ plus founders and entrepreneurs, and to amplify our stories, ultimately drive the economic empowerment of the queer community. Over the past 10 years, we've built a community of over 17,000 members, and we support 300 plus entrepreneurs every year. StartOut is the world's largest organization supporting LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs. And we've got a number of events throughout the year that you're going to want to learn about and participate in. We've got our growth lab. We've got over 300 members. We've got experts in fundraising, a network of over 250 investors, countless connections. If you're not already a member of StartOut, you definitely want to join up. We are an LGBTQ plus organization, but we love having our allies and the members. So please, like I say, join up and welcome and participate in future events with us. We have a slew of valued sponsors, and I'm not going to call them out all here in this slide, but you can see here we've got a lot of strong support in the community. So with that, let me start to introduce our various participants. First of all, we've got Kelli Jones with 68 Capital. We've got Charlie O'Donnell with Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. We've got Lorenzo Thone from Gangels and Ray Trans from Accelerprise. I'm going to let each of those introduce themselves, but let's go ahead and pull down the slides and we'll start looking at our participants. Emma, can you drop the slide? Thank you. Thank you. Kelli, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm Kelli Jones. I am Managing Director, General Partner for 68 Capital. We are a pre-seed and seed stage fund focused on investing in Black, Latinx, women, and LGBTQ plus founders. Our goal really is just to close the undercapitalized, underrepresented founder gap, both in the Midwest and in Indiana, where we're based. I consider myself an ally. And so I'm here to share as much information as I can, connect with as many people as I can, and honestly, try our best to serve a number of people that I think are continuing to be underserved in our ecosystem.
Great. Lorenzo.
Sure. Hi, I'm Lorenzo Tione. It was painful to see the number 2009 as the date StartOut was founded because it dates me. I'm one of the co-founders of StartOut, but these days I'm also a managing director at Gangels. Gangels is actually one of the largest and most active venture investment syndicates in the country, and the only one that's dedicated to diversity at all stages of leadership in the venture ecosystem. Our mission is really to create the circumstances for a more inclusive and accessible and equitable venture ecosystem, starting from the founding team all the way to the group of LPs that power venture. We work at all stages of growth, from early to later stage. We focus on diverse teams where diversity exists, including and specifically LGBTQ and gender inclusive and non-conforming founders. But we also are really focused on helping all of our companies become more inclusive. And there's a lot of ways in which we actively help our portfolio company bring in diverse talent, diversify their boards, which is one thing that often gets forgotten, and ultimately represent a very diverse group of LPs and investors in the cap table of some of the most compelling companies in the venture capital ecosystem.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ray, would you like to go next?
Hi, my name is Ray. I am an investor with Excel Prize. We are an early stage fund. We generally invest in B2B software. And before Excel Prize, I was like a forward deployed engineer at Palantir Technologies. And before Palantir, I was a management and strategy consultant at Accenture.
Great. And last but not least, Charlie.
Hi, I'm Charlie O'Donnell with Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. I'm a solo general partner. I focused on pre-seed and seed rounds that we lead or co-lead in companies based in New York City across a wide range of industries, and generally really focused on being the most accessible fund in New York and trying to take down all of the kind of structural and institutional barriers to getting engagement with the fund.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that we could have all of you here tonight. So the format of this evening is an Ask Me Anything kind of forum. So we're looking forward to a lot of participation from our audience. It's just going to be a casual discussion. All my panelists, you can go ahead and unmute because we're just going to chat together. I'd like to start this out with the simple question, why do each of you feel that representation matters everywhere? And Ray, would you like to take that to begin with?
Yeah, sure. So I guess like a brief background of myself. So I'm an immigrant. I came from Vietnam, and I was raised in a very conservative household. So I think the journey was, for me, similar to a lot of people, who are sort of discovering themselves and trying to find where they land on, like gender, orientation and such. So I had to really learn to be an ally. And I think in pursuing what I pursued in consulting, as well as being a part of Palantir, it was not ever a workspace that was inclusive. At Palantir, there was 80% white, 80% male. Couldn't imagine what orientation was like because we had no data on that. And I think just being a part of that, I wanted to move to a fund in which I had more agency to control, like where we deploy capital and also, like who we bring onto the team. So my very first investment actually was at someone I met at a StartOut social. So, I wanted to learn to be a part of the community as I was sort of just going through my own journey of, like understanding who I was. And it was someone who I was like, oh, this person's a really cool friend. And it just so happened that he was also a founder building an incredible business. And it was actually my very first investment, Violet, if anyone knows him. And that is, I think that's where I got started since, like I want my investments to be not harmful to the world, hopefully, and potentially maybe do also some good. I do think that representation is a big part of what will be determining ethical technology. I do believe in technology. I believe in the future should be utilized technology, but I do think that if you have representation, it means that technology will be well considered for the mass majority of people versus being, like for privileged people, for white males.
Excellent answer. Kelli, Charlie.
Sure, I'll jump in. I think for me, I think the goals of representation and inclusion really do align with what my main goal is as a fund, and that's to make the most money for my investors. It's I think important to try and leave the world a better place than where you found it in everything that you do. And that's, the kinds of investments that I like to make. But to be honest, I am foremost trying to make a return, right? And when I think about how I do that, I try and see every deal possible, and I try and think about improving my deal funnel and making sure that once I do make an investment, the opportunity set of the companies is as beneficial for them as possible, and the talent base that they're recruiting is large as possible. And in trying to figure out if I'm doing that, I realized that there are a lot of structural barriers that don't provide better returns, right? There are a lot of, the reality is like each of our networks unfortunately looks, or at least unfortunately for my case as a, kind of generic straight white guy, is our networks look like ourselves, right? And too much so. And then when I look at that, sort of natural inertia, I'm like, well, does that give me better deal flow? And it doesn't, right? I don't necessarily believe that, I have better or worse deal flow sort of depending on, the background of the founder. But I do believe that if the founders only look like me, I'm missing out on good deals. I do believe that if the employee bases of the companies only look like me, we're missing out on great talent. And so I've really tried to focus on, for the benefit of making better returns, how do we eliminate some of those barriers? And it's also something that, is just the kind of world I want to live in. But, my number one job is that of being an investor and trying to make money. And I think those things are highly, highly aligned.
I think that's a great answer, Charlie. And your actions speak truth to your words. If I look on Crunchbase, it says you've got over 36 diversity investments in your portfolio. So thank you for being an ally. As a out proud trans woman, I wish there were more like you. So Lorenzo, representation, what are your thoughts?
So I feel like pretty much everything I've ever done in my professional career has had kind of the influence of seeking to create more representation in various ways. I actually have worked, of course, I've started companies, I work as an investor, but I also have this crazy other career as a writer, producer on Broadway. And even that work has been colored by the idea that representation matters every time. I really think, Gangels was born with the mission, still has the mission to balance the idea of allowing and seeking great return for people's investments with the idea of creating social change, positive social change through the allocation of capital. And I really think there's no more effective way to create incentives for people to get out there and do things that break with the order of things that has been for a long time, than to see themselves reflected in what is possible, because there's nothing more sort of demoralizing than the idea that something is just not possible for you because of what you look like or where you come from or what language you speak or whatnot. And so creating opportunities for representation and seeing yourself represented as a company founder, as an investor, as an LP, as on the Broadway stage is the kind of things that really gets people out there to push for change and to act out that change in their lives. So I really do believe it's super important in everything. And we try to, in the way in which we both make investments and help the companies that we invest in, really create the reflection of the reality of their staff, of their customers, of their business partners, of the society in which they belong, to create more of that representation. And as they succeed, that creates more opportunities for people to see what is possible for them.
Wow, excellent, excellent. Kelli, I can't wait to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that everyone has said so far is true. I know I can say for myself is, my goal is to hopefully put myself out of business. My goal is hopefully to change the way we even talk about what is underrepresented or undercapitalized. The fact of the matter is there's more of us, right, in the world when it comes to people of color, women, LGBTQ, disabled. There's more of us than anything. So I think it's more for me about not telling the story from a place of lack or a place of struggle, but from a place of you're missing out by not uncovering this opportunity. And that's the way I choose to tell this story, so that this doesn't even have to be a conversation we have to continue to have. So for me, it's literally about solving the problem and being a conduit for how we even talk about the problem. Because I don't know if it's a problem for the founders more than it's a problem for the institutions. And I think we all have the opportunity and the responsibility to change the way that looks. And so for me, being a very non-traditional person in VC, given my background, kind of similar to Lorenzo, I was, in tech, but mostly in the entertainment space. I come from a very different perspective on how to look at companies and how to look at opportunities. And I think I can help solve some of these issues. And so I think if we start talking about this from just a different place, right? The place that we're talking about it from now, which is, we're higher returns, our bottom lines are raised. The buying power of underrepresented groups is much higher than others. The fact that we've not been investing in diversity is missing out on $1 trillion of GDP. So I think that's the story we should be telling, not, what small percentage of people are not getting access. And I think when we change those narratives, we change the perception. So that's why I do this work.
Kelli, that was incredibly inspiring. I speak from my own truth. As I mentioned, I'm an out proud trans founder, and I go into a lot of meetings feeling like, I'm going to hear another no. There's another no. There's another reason why somebody doesn't want to do a deal with me. But what I heard from you is so empowering that I'm going to go into those meetings next and thinking why you're going to miss out if you don't do business with me, because my opportunity is incredible. Yeah. Wow. I love that. Thank you. Talk for a minute about access for diverse founders. Kelli and I are in the Midwest, and access to diverse founders is particularly challenging in the more conservative middle of the country that it is in the coast. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can maybe improve that access. And I want to just go back to Kelli with that, and then we'll go around the room. Instead of me calling everybody out, just jump in with that.
Yeah, I have a very different perspective, I think. So I'm from the Midwest, born and raised in Indianapolis. I moved back 4 years ago. I spent most of my career in New York. I was in New York for about 8 years. I was in LA for another 3. So I had the experience of living across the country, doing a lot of really incredible things. And in this work, which, at this point, I've been sort of in this D&I and tech space since 2010. I thought there was a huger opportunity for me to come back home and stand something up and really impact locally than it was for me to try to solve a problem on the East or the West Coast, right? And so what I think we get the opportunity to do is to create these smaller ecosystems that we can replicate in other places. And I think the way we lead in that is our ability to be nimble, our ability to move quickly, with having less red tape to have to go through. So if you start seeing smaller cities like Indianapolis or Louisville or Cincinnati start having more increased representation than you may see in what's considered larger cities, I think you start to pay attention to what's happening. And I think that's the impact that I think we want to have with our organization. So, the way that I look at even just deal flow is we spent, the first 3 or 4 years building up our accelerator programs and our career training programs so that we could at least be able to start having deal flow that we could start looking at. Our goal wasn't even to start a fund for another probably 3 or 4 years, but we saw really quickly that the companies we were working with were absolutely incredible, but the VC ecosystem wasn't able to serve them. And so it was like, if we didn't move fast enough in starting a fund, these companies were going to fail solely because of access. And so we had to, essentially press the gas and move our entire timeline up a couple years in order to be able to have an impact. And what the amazing thing is about that now is that our first company that went through one of our first accelerators has officially raised their entire first round ever. They've never, as a Black founder, ever raised any money, right? So we're seeing that impact is starting to happen. What was once a time where we didn't have diverse founders, even here in Indianapolis, is now totally changing. And so now that we have the impact or have the ability to invest directly into these businesses, we believe that we can completely change what the ecosystem looks like. So I think with even the last year of Corona and COVID-19, access to people has totally changed. You can talk to people that you maybe have never been able to talk to in your life. You've been able to get in contact with people you've never been able to see. Access to monetary grants and things like that have increased like crazy. If there was ever a time to be a diverse or underrepresented founder, I'd say it's now. And I would take advantage of it. But the goal for me, hopefully, is that these conversations don't get stale and that this work does not become, sort of a mockery, but actually is able to solve some problems.
Wow. Panel, thoughts?
I think Kelli made the point that I wanted to make, so I agree 100%, which is if there is one good thing that might have come out of this year, which of course has had, sort of negative effects in a lot of different ways, but it's sort of an equalization that sort of has removed barriers of access that traditionally, revolved around geographic and institutional and educational boundaries and so on. And, I know that I, as an investor, have been able to have more conversations with both co-investors and founders in this past year than I could possibly ever imagine to have had in a otherwise normal year. I literally was able to teleport myself from place to place and from corner of the country in markets where it would have just been difficult on one hand, maybe I wasn't there, but also if we believe that sort of undercapitalized and underrepresented founders would have also had less access to the privilege of traveling and going and being in San Francisco or in LA to just do a bunch of investor meetings, that has created an enormous opportunity to actually go and seek out the as Charlie was saying, the otherwise missed out opportunity on great return, on great companies, on great founders that you would have not seen because you weren't there and they weren't where you otherwise were. So, I really hope that if there are a few things that we take away from this past year is that we maintain some of the so that we stick with having abandoned some of those social contracts or requirement that in order to have a pitch, you had to be in the same room. In order for me to make an investment, I couldn't possibly do that if I hadn't met you in person. We've all proven that's absolutely BS. And, we should stick with it because it will benefit underrepresented founders significantly more.
Wonderful. Great.
I'll jump in. I think I don't actually, I think there's different levels of access. There's one level of access, which is like, can you reach an investor, period, right? And between all of the various digital connections, the number of VCs that sort of put themselves out there and all of this sort of stuff, the multiple channels, the clubhouses, all of this other stuff. I mean, could you imagine being a founder in the 70s where like literally like you didn't even know who the VCs were, let alone like it was really sort of like a secret society almost. That like, what do you mean there are people who will fund my prototype? Like if you weren't at MIT or Stanford, you didn't even know that these people existed, right? So today that aspect is wide open. The next level down is you want to get taken seriously, right? And I think that's where I wrote a post not too long ago that was using the term like both things can be true. And this is where I think it's sort of a big hurdle for founders to go after. There are many instances where people come into a meeting with their own personal biases and look, we all have them, right? It is tough to escape, our own sort of personal experience and try and have a sort of broader worldview. There are ways in which you may feel slighted, not understood, not getting the same benefit of the doubt that somebody else might, and those are real. But at the same time, I think the vast majority of people who are in venture and investing are primarily, more than anything else, really trying to make money and really are they're not bad people. Maybe they're not all my people, but they're generally, I think, pretty decent folks. And I think there are instances. I remember having a conversation with one of the founders that I've backed, who is both fits into a multiple sort of underrepresented, kind of categories. And this founder felt like she wasn't taken seriously in the meeting, or not to the extent that she would be if she was sort of the generic straight white guy. And at the same time, their growth trajectory really wasn't where it should be. And so I was like, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some things that, you experienced in that meeting that were real, but at the same time, you would have had a better shot if your growth was there, right? And I think that's really hard to pull apart, right? To walk away from that meeting and think that, and realize that like most people don't get funded. It is really, really hard to do. The bar is super high, and most people have biases, and to keep pushing forward sort of past that, I think there are a lot of aspects of access that people feel like funding isn't for them because of these real biases. And I just try and encourage people to say, like, keep plugging away, because people do want to make money and they are looking for good deals.
Great point. Great point. My takeaway from your comment there is that even if you're a diverse founder engaging with a diverse, positive fund source, you still got to have a decent business plan, a good opportunity for it to be considered in the first place.
Right.
Got it. I hear that. Ray, would you like to offer any other thought on that?
Sure. I think, like can't disagree with anyone that's spoken. And I think from my point of view, like, I guess like briefly on my background, most of my friends from home are in food service. So, there is a very low income immigrant community. However, most of my friends from college and of course my professional life are like extremely privileged. VC is a very privileged world. It's a very, plush sort of lifestyle sometimes. And a lot of people from VC are from very privileged backgrounds. You will see a lot of brand name schools, brand name companies. And unfortunately, when you're an early stage investor, you also have to think about what companies will raise after. Like it has to be a good business, it's got to be solid, but later stage funds will oftentimes be like, oh yes, that founder also has an extremely pedigree, like resume, the good schools, the good companies. And we try not to index on that. I led my company's like data collection scheme, essentially, to be like, who are we actually investing in? And we definitely realized that, a lot of our founders that we take calls with have bachelor degrees. So they finish college, which is a privilege, even though it's a right, it's currently a privilege. And a lot of them have, backgrounds from names that are recognizable in, like the Fortune 1000 companies, or like just really brand name early stage startups. So unfortunately, there are definitely biases that we encounter, as good intentioned as we are. And we try to like counteract that by recognizing it. Was part of like my data project, was to understand who exactly we're taking calls with, and like who goes to partner calls, who goes to investment committee, and who ultimately gets an offer. However, I talk to my venture colleagues sometimes, and as much as I love them, a lot of them are just like, oh, we don't do that. Like we don't care. Like we're not tracking who we take calls with, who we give offers to in terms of their diversity or ethnicity or anything like that. So I do think that, there's a lot of obstacles in the way. What sometimes I've done, because my fund is we're very new, like we're basically like just taking money from like the LPs our LPs are like Zoom. So like Eric, who founded Zoom, and we have the flexibility to pretty much like be pretty autonomous. I can educate my partners on being, on talking to underrepresented, or like Black women tech founders, for example. I realized, I was like, oh, my partners can't really talk to them. Like they can't really talk to like women engineers, and like specifically Black women engineers. I was like, wow, what happened here? But I was able to educate my partners on how to like navigate the conversation, you know, like with types of founders that they don't talk to regularly. However, you know, I know that not everyone has that kind of autonomy. I would just seek it out if possible, you know, to educate the people on your team, to provide founders some more space, and, you know, like provide some more space for different types of founders. I think another thing that founders can maybe do as a way of advice is to, you know, join a communities of power, join a communities of privilege. It sucks, but, you know, there are like these Slack groups, there are like the clubhouses, and unfortunately, I think it is still the best way to get in touch with investors, because that is just where we are. That's where we know a lot of deal stream comes in. So I would honestly start there.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience. Let's just start with the first one. What suggestions do you have for pre-revenue businesses that are seeking capital?
So I can take this one first. Sorry, Lorenza. So we invest in pre-revenue businesses all the time as an early stage fund. And I think if you have caught up with anything in the market recently, it is a very hot space right now for early stage. There's a lot of capital, there's a lot of liquidity. I do think though, if you're pre-revenue, for me at least, because I'm from somewhat of a technical background, you better have a good product. You should have at least, you know, like an MVP, or ideally you'd be in a pilot of some sort with some sort of customers, and you should have something that you can demo. Essentially, I always ask for demos. That's one of my forms of technical diligence is, can you run through the product with me live? And if you can show that the product works, you know, you can show that you have some interest in terms of pre-sales, in terms of a waiting list, a beta list, or even like actual pilots with enterprise. So Violet, you know, had like hundreds of people on its platform by the time that we signed with them, and they were in discussions with a pilot with a health organization. And while it was no tangible sort of SaaS revenue yet, we knew that it was like a possibility for them to convert that into tangible revenue. So I think that if you don't have revenue in this day and age, or in this specific time in the market, it's perfectly fine. However, I would really index on product.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that same subject?
Yeah, I think in general, everyone's plan is to make revenue, right? There's no one even, you know, even going back to like, you know, the first day that Twitter was launched, and people go back and say, well, you know, Twitter never had a business plan. Like, that's not actually true. Like, they had to get the site to stay up for more than a day at a time before they, you know, decided to implement that business model. But there was always a plan to make money. I just think my advice across the board, no matter what stage you're at, whether you do not have revenue today, whether you do not have a product today, or whether you do have some revenue, 80+% of your pitch has to be about the future, right? So to get tangled up in either oh my, I don't have revenue yet, maybe I shouldn't be pitching you, or the other side of that, right? Clearly I have revenue, or I've gotten to profitability, and therefore you should fund me. Like that, all of that stuff is kind of backward and present looking. And most of the pitch needs to be forward looking, right? It's not a reward for what you've done. It's like selling tickets to the future, right? And that's really where you need the focus. And what you're doing now is like support for that, right? So if you don't have revenue yet, but you have reason to believe that there will be, like, you're going to be talking about that. If you have some, you're going to be saying, okay, well, you know, me in my spare time trying to do this business, I've sold X amount of clients, but my plan is to hire 4 full-time salespeople in the next however many months, and they likely to be at least twice as good as I am. And here's the financial model that says that. But it's so much of the pitch has to be forward-looking. And I think founders in general need to spend less time talking about like what they've done previously with this company.
I look at 3 things. I look at is the vision big enough? That definitely is a big part of it. And so what Charlie was saying, but then I look at, can you execute? And does anybody care? And neither of those two things really mean you have to have revenue yet. Revenue is definitely a way in which you can demonstrate that you can execute and that people care. But there are other ways to what Ray was saying, show me what you've done in what period of time. Have you built a product? Have you done, to some extent, yes, the present and the past doesn't necessarily matter in the context of how much money I should give you, but it removes a certain amount of risk of unknown about things like, can you actually execute reasonably fast and well on some of what your vision is? And then ultimately, do people care can be expressed in a lot of different ways, right? If you have an enormous waiting list for people waiting to use your product, there is something about what you're doing that people care about. And then the question of how much money you will be able to extract and how efficiently from those people that care is something that ultimately becomes a little bit second order. It's certainly not something I'm super interested at the very, very early stage of investing.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of wrap it up, I'm kind of on the same page as Lorenzo. You don't really have enough data to really be able to make a huge decision around what this company can do when they're pre-revenue. But I know for me, a few things, it's more about founder fit for me. Do I like the people? And do I believe that they can actually do the thing that they're saying they're going to do? And then I think to Lorenzo's point, it's how much pre-work have you done? Have you done customer discovery? It doesn't seem like there's some interest in the idea that you have. Is the market large enough that you can convince me that this is a problem that needs to be solved? And then why are you the person to solve it? Those are really the only things I can really base any decision off of when you're pre-revenue. And so I'm digging more into essentially whether or not I like you and whether or not I believe you can do it. And that for me is probably the most important part, even when they are making revenue. So
one thing I'll tack on to, it's really important to qualify your investors. I think what happens sometimes too is like you're pre-revenue, you go and pitch someone who has never ever invested in a company that is pre-revenue. And then they tell you you need revenue. And then you go thinking that like every VC feels the same way. And like, I would say 50% of the companies that I've backed haven't even launched yet, right? So like, it's a different thing when I turn you down because I would have invested if I liked this deal, no matter what the stage, versus, Laconia Capital, who's a great sort of seed plus level investor, and they're sort of enterprise revenue focused, and like they're going to tell you it's not good to have revenue because that's what the stage that they like to invest in. So you have to ask those questions to make sure you're pitching the right investor.
Gotcha. So to the audience, I just want to let you know, family situation came up. Kelly's going to need to leave us a little earlier, but before she goes, you talked about you got to like that company, Kelly. There's a question in the panel about what's the archetype that you look for when you look for that founder that really excites you, fires you up. And I'd like to lead with Kelly so that when you do need to drop, you can do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So one is, do I get excited when you talk about the idea? If I don't get the feeling that you like what you're building, like I'm not going to believe you. So there's no need to even go forward. So I have to feel the excitement coming off of you, that you're really excited about this idea, about the path you're going down, about the opportunity. That's a big one for me. I think founders that are coachable are very important. I think that's more going to the relationship you have with a prospective investor or even your board or employees. This is a lonely sort of place to be, but it's also going to be something that's going to be difficult. And being able to lean in and being a learner and always wanting to thrive is really big. I also really love founders that interview me back. I always tell founders, especially when we're in program for Accelerate, so sometimes I have to toss my hat, Because when I'm in an accelerator program, like I'm talking to them very differently than I am when I'm being an investor. But the thing I always tell them is that you are the prize. You get to choose who invests in you. So I like when founders ask me questions about how do I provide value? What can I do to help them? What does my network look like? Because it lets me know that they're looking for investors, not just to see who can write a check, but that who will also help them with their company, who will also provide value, who will be willing to make connections to strategic partnerships and different things like that. And when I get that energy, that lets me know that they care about their business just as much as they care about who's invested in it. So that's always something that gets me hype. And then as we're looking at more like seed stage, obviously we're looking at financials and forecasts and all that great stuff. But for me, like I like to get excited about the founder first. That's usually where I fall in love with a deal.
I like that answer. Kelli, though, I want to ask a question, and I want to offer this out to the whole panel as well. When you're thinking about coachability in that investor, what's the difference between coachability and having somebody that just wants to be a yes man to please you? I mean, do you need somebody that's got a little fire and is willing to stick to their guns, not stupidly, but boldly?
I like fire. I like when people are convicted, right? So it's not about just always taking what I say or a suggestion, right? Like I always tell people, I'm gonna give you feedback. You have a choice whether or not you want to take it or not. That's always gonna be up to you, and that's always gonna be your decision. I think the difference is how people take advice or suggestions or versus how it may be if it's someone that might be a little bit more on the defensive. I think in general, that's sort of a red flag for management sort of things. Not always, not all the time, because I think those are things that can also be taught. But for me, it's just that openness of wanting to have some sort of advice or wanting to lean in on someone or knowing that you don't have to do it by yourself. I think that's just really important. Even if you're thinking about growing something that's gonna have a lot of scale and a lot of growth, you're gonna have to be open and willing to relinquish some control and listen to other people.
Great. So drop off whenever you need to, participate as long as you can. But okay. I want to thank you, Kelli, for being here. Great words, great insight.
And I'm so sorry for having to leave a little early, but I will stay on a few more minutes because I can stay on a little bit longer.
No apologies necessary.
Awesome. Thank you.
So everybody else, the rest of the panel, tell me about your archetype. Tell me about coachability. Tell me your thoughts.
The coachability thing is an interesting term. And I think sometimes like two investors could have two totally different reactions to the same person. And there is, look, not everybody meshes, right? Anybody who's ever interacted with another human being knows that like sometimes you just hit it off and sometimes you don't. And we try and ascribe sort of certain descriptions on, who we sort of prefer as founders and who we don't. I think to me, look, like I assume that you know way more about this business than I do, right? I have to make that assumption because I'm a generalist, right? Maybe if I was like sort of a category expert and had just sold a company in the space, like, for certain angels, that might not be the case. So I'm likely to give you the benefit of the doubt on when it comes to industry knowledge. But what I am trying to figure out is like, can I trust your thinking process, right? Can I trust that when you don't know the answer, you can admit it, and that you'll go after it and you'll try and find it. And most importantly, like, are you listening? So I don't really care so much if somebody, listens to me and says, well, actually, we don't want to do that because X, Y, and Z. And half the time when the founders I back tell me that, I'm like, right, because you just brought up something that somebody who eats, sleeps, and breathes this industry would know. And I've been thinking about it for all of 2 minutes. So like, feel free to ignore me. Like, I love when that happens, right? It sort of puts me back in my place of like, oh yeah, this is all they do, of course, right? But at least they listen, because occasionally I do think of something that they didn't think of, maybe just from an outsider's perspective, right? I think it's important not to come off as sort of dismissive, but more so than anything else, you should be convincing. And also, like, this is a two-way process. You know, Kelli talked about interviewing me. You know, there are certain ways that you want to run this company. And if you're getting the feeling that I'm trying to push you in a different direction, maybe I'm not the right investor for you. There's no way that I'm the only investor on the face of the earth that will ever invest in this company, and that you cannot afford to just let me go, right? If you feel like we're not on the same page, or I want you to go into an area that's not the one that you want to go into, like, you shouldn't be afraid to sort of say that when you feel we're not on the same page.
Great. Lorenzo, thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with Charlie a lot. You know, I think that there's definitely, the first thing is to admit that as investors, we are not running the business. We're not living and breathing the sort of the issues. We don't understand it as well as the founder does. I think that, you know, especially talking about super early stage, one thing that I look for is the recognition that even though you've spent, you know, all this time thinking about this, you're at the very beginning of a very unknown path. And you have to understand and realize that the only thing that you can certainly be certain of is that whatever plan you've made is wrong, and that you're going to learn a lot of things along the way that are going to change your mind. If I get the sense that that everything is mapped out, and that there's basically very little room for new data and information to come in to change your mind, then I get nervous, right? It's basically like you've made a perfect plan and you're just going to stay on that plan no matter what you learn from the market, no matter what you learn from your investors or you know, whatever. Then that's more about being, you know, that sort of closed-minded that Charlie was referring to. But ultimately, I also, not only I see certainly myself as a generalist, but we also are not, you know, lead investors. We don't take board seats. We tend to be resources for the entrepreneur. And so we want to be there to help them when they have an ask and they have a question, put our knowledge, our network, our resources at the service of the entrepreneur and of the company, rather than go and try and tell them how to run their business, which is really not what we want to do.
Gotcha. Ray, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think my archetype is probably someone who's really thoughtful and has shown that they have thought about the critical questions that will face them as they scale and grow the company. So an example is, Violet is a platform for queer folks to find non-discriminatory trained mental health professionals. And that's not something that we would invest in, to be honest. I don't think that my fund would have invested in it until I had spoken to Grong, who's the founder. And he very much was explicit that he was trying to make it a data company. Like he was gonna have a database of trained professionals who he could then provide for health organizations like Aetna, etc. And that's incredibly valuable, just because data is incredibly valuable. And I do think that that shows that he's thought it out for what it will be at scale. Like it wasn't going to be consumer play. And alternatively, another investment I made was in like a digital asset management company. And, like he was starting in gaming, and gaming itself is a space that's big, but potentially not something that was going to be super compelling for a lot of my partners. However, like having explained to me, the founder having explained to me that design is all encapsulating, it's NASA to TV to construction to clothing. And I understood that right away. And, that vision is quite large for venture scale. And so I think that when founders show that they have thought about what will be at scale, particularly about, like what their business model, how their business model will change, and also how their technology might be used in the future. I think that's really compelling. And additionally, I think that if they think about the ethical ramifications of their technology in the future, it's extremely compelling just for me individually. So, you know, like when I talk about AI companies or when I talk to machine learning companies, I always try to ask about like, hey, like how would this further, you know, like amplify bias in our AI categorization already? And if they have an answer for that, they've thought about it, then I'm impressed. You know, like I'm a little bit less worried. But when someone says like, oh, like actually it's not a concern of ours right now, then I do think that it shows that they're not actually understanding the environment that we're in and also not understanding the technology that they're doing. Because anyone who works in AI and ML nowadays knows that there's, you know, like biases just ingrained. And if you don't think about, I guess, like when you scale, how that technology further perpetuates it, then I don't think that you're going to be a good founder, essentially.
Great, thank you, thank you. I'm going to kind of combine two questions that I've got in my Q&A group into one. So we've got a question: what growth rate do you expect when you're considering an investment? We also have another question about how do you see public benefit corporations and mission-driven startups? And Charlie a moment ago was talking about how he's really looking for a business opportunity. And what I want to do is have a loose discussion about is a mission its own benefit, that, you know, if there's a strong mission that you align with that might not have the revenue prospect, can that still be an interesting investment opportunity? And if not, what kind of rate of return are you looking for regardless of the company? And I know that's a little loosey-goosey, but let's just chat.
Yeah, I think you have to be really careful when mission potentially comes at the expense of the economic stability and growth potential of the business. I think there are plenty of opportunities to do good and leave the world a better place when you found it and make money doing it. I think there are some instances where, you know, there are economic opportunities that aren't great businesses, and the fact that they happen to have a mission attached to them almost like excuses is the founders attempting to excuse the fact that they aren't great business ideas by saying, well, you know, there's also a mission here. And I would just push a lot of those founders to say, can you, you know, do more here? Can you make a bigger impact? Is there a more financially lucrative way to, you know, have a bigger impact? You know, is this really the best version of this business model? And you know, think about it like a barbell kind of approach, right? Where there are some where the answer is no, and actually the right structure for the business is a nonprofit, right? So I would sort of say, like, either you push this thing to actually be a nonprofit, or you look for more lucrative models that also have, you know, an impact. You know, the other thing I would say too is, like, I'm investing in businesses where, you know, for example, I'm in the process of closing a deal for a company called Aria Health. They do the back end management of federally qualified health clinics, right? Most of those clinics themselves are nonprofits, but being in the business of servicing them is a potentially lucrative for-profit business. This business helps them run more profitably and helps them do more good. So those two things can be, you know, very, very synergistic. And you know, I like seeing mission-driven businesses, but I think they need to be good businesses too.
Wonderful. Lorenzo.
I mean, I agree. I think that the biggest issue and the problem that I have as an investor is when the mission is an excuse for a worse business, effectively. But on the converse, I see the mission, or the even just like maybe the sustainability or whatever it is that you want to look at it as potentially a differentiation and something that makes the business a more compelling business from the point of view of generating sales or generating interest and being an upsell, even though potentially you're looking at unit economics that are worse. So you're saying, okay, I'm going to do this and it's a sustainable way of doing it, and everything costs more and my unit economics are worse and my margins are less, but this means that more people will care, and this is ultimately where the world is going, and this is a bigger opportunity to make money. That can be a good way of actually looking at sort of the balance and the trade-off between being hyper-focused in the small and say, I'm going to find absolutely the most efficient way to make money, which may be in that case the one that sort of discounts the mission. But taking a bigger picture, you're saying, okay, it's a slightly less efficient way of make money, but ultimately a better business, economically speaking too, because it can be a compelling differentiation from competition, or because the world is moving towards, adopting, say, green energy versus something that is carbon fossils. So that's just, but largely I agree with Charlie.
Great. Ray?
Yeah, so I think Lorenzo and Charlie both mentioned that investors are sometimes wary of greenwashing or like cause washing. I think there's definitely some founders who have spoken to where I'm like, this is objectively not a business that I will invest in, and then at the very end, those were like, and there's also a social impact clause to this, and I was like, you're not going to convince me with that. And some investors do, like buy into it, and some others don't. I've definitely seen some quote unquote well-intentioned startups have pretty, like detrimental impact sometimes. And sometimes it makes other investors wary of doing, like you get burned by one investment, you're like not going to do another investment. Sometimes a lot that happens. But on the whole, I take it as on an ad hoc basis. I don't necessarily consider, my first investment was like, had a social impact. I didn't necessarily consider it as a social impact investment. It was just like a data investment for me. And I think for us, we are not an impact fund. However, if there is something that clearly has a positive impact in society, then it's just sweetens the deal, I suppose. There was another health equity play that we invested in that I was just like, yeah, like this can't hurt, this won't evolve into technology that will hurt. And it's great outcomes because like Kelli mentioned before, that the number of women is half of the population, and the number of minorities is a growing part of the population. LGBTQ people, if you add them all together, it's the majority of the population. So therefore, it's a huge market, and it makes business sense. I think what I will caveat is that sometimes there are a lot of like great businesses that will be, like create intergenerational wealth for the founders and have like a pretty good exit. They may not be venture scale sometimes. They might scare off some investors who are sort of like, we can only make an investment that we believe will have like, 100x returns.
Wonderful, wonderful. Listen, we have just a moment left before we need to clear out. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So just in the last few seconds, I'd like to go around the room and ask one quick question. I know that your inbox on your LinkedIn is going to get hit a bunch after an event like this. Is there one thing that you would want to tell a prospective startup or founder? Do this before you contact me. Do this first. Ray, we'll start with you.
So I do B2B software investing. We're flexible. We do B2B2C, we do marketplaces, we do sometimes government interfacing plays. However, we don't do software, and we rarely will do consumer unless you have like a very stratified plan on how you plan to pivot from consumer into B2B. And so that's what I'll caveat. I get a lot of deals, or I get a lot of inbounds from very pure consumer plays and some hardware plays, and I can't invest in that. It's just not within our company's thesis. So I would, like have that in mind if you're gonna inbound to me. And otherwise, what like a couple of sentences doesn't hurt. If you have a doc send, or like a link that you want to share your deck, that's also great, just so that I can make sure I like make use of both of our times efficiently if it's something's already out of our thesis. So for example, we don't invest in close competitors to companies that we invest in like in the last year or so, just because we work really closely with our founders, and we don't believe in saying that we're investing in your competitor. So, if I see one that's really similar, then I'll just be like, hey, sorry, we would love to, but can't invest. But still, I oftentimes will introduce my, people that I can't invest in to other investors in my network. So happy to do that, but I prefer more information than not.
Love it, love it. So in summary, do your homework before you reach out to Ray. Lorenzo, 30-second advice.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my filter is very broad, in the sense that if you want to reach out and you feel like there's some way that I can help, do reach out. Angels is a very atypical investor. I mean, we're not a fund. We only co-invest. We never lead. So if the round is not formed and there isn't a round together that we can participate, that doesn't make any sense for Angels to invest. But especially if there's a diverse team, you're a diverse underrepresented founder, we want to help in other ways. And that may very well, we work with dozens and dozens of other co-investors with which we do rounds all the time. And so the first thing I'll do is I'll help with introductions and, direct you to folks that are maybe the right folks to actually start talking to. Ultimately, the only filter is we're venture investors, so it needs to be the type of business that, like Ray was saying, has at least the vision and the potential to achieve venture scale. And so that's really the only filter that makes sense. Otherwise, we're sector agnostic, stage agnostic. We're just very active, and we want to help diversify both your company and the ecosystem in as many ways as we can.
Great. Charlie, quick thought.
Yeah, I would generally say LinkedIn is not the best way to initially connect with somebody. My email's right on my site. Emails are pretty guessable, to be honest. Even if you don't have it, it's a great way to do research on who somebody might know if they require that kind of connection. But I always find the I saw you at a conference, so let's share networks thing like a little just not for me, because you don't really know me that well, and you might not want to give me access to your network, and I like to be able to vouch for everybody in my network. So I look at LinkedIn as sort of a, I actually know you and can vouch for you, and most people probably don't pay attention to their LinkedIn inboxes. So I would say, direct email. I almost think social media is better. A response to a tweet probably gets more notice than a LinkedIn spammy inbox thing.
Love it. To all my panel, thank you so much for participating tonight. I really appreciate the thoughts, the inputs, the insight. This has been really helpful to the participants and to me personally. So thank you for being here. Also to all the people that have joined up, save the date. We've got more events coming up, including our Wind Down Wednesday on April 28th. Join up with StartOut. The deadline for our next Growth Lab cohort is tonight. You can go to StartOut's website and get more information and apply. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you all for being here. You have a great night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.